73 pounds of rotting mahogany and rusted brass. That was all Clara inherited, while her siblings walked away with prime real estate and hefty stock portfolios. For 3 years, family members snickered behind her back, calling her the naive fool who dragged a broken, unsellable grandfather clock into a cramped apartment just out of blind sentimentality. They stopped laughing when a jammed pendulum swung back, revealing a hollow cavity that led to a truth no one saw coming. A meticulously hidden chamber containing exactly $198 million in untraceable gold bullion. Here is how a family's cruelest joke became its greatest regret. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon light, cutting through the blinds of Harrison Gable's law office. The mahogany-paneled room smelled faintly of stale coffee and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic scent Clara was used to at the pediatric clinic, where she worked long, grueling shifts. She sat rigidly in a wingback chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the frayed cuffs of her wool coat, a stark indicator of her financial reality. To her left sat her sister, Beatrice Higgins Smythe. Beatrice was dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, her fingers adorned with diamonds that caught the light whenever she impatiently tapped her phone. To Clara's right was their brother, Richard Higgins, a commercial real estate developer whose aggressive ambition was matched only by his widening waistline. They were here for the reading of Uncle Arthur's will. Arthur Pendleton had been a reclusive, eccentric man. After his wife passed away 3 decades ago, he had hoarded himself away in his sprawling, decaying Victorian mansion in Albany. The family whispered about his declining mental state, his paranoia, and his strange obsession with antique horology, the study of time and clocks. Beatrice and Richard had largely ignored him, visiting only on major holidays out of grim obligation. Clara, however, had visited every Sunday. She had brought him groceries, listened to his rambling stories about the gold standard and market collapses, and sat quietly with him in his study, surrounded by the deafening silence of dozens of broken timepieces. Harrison Gable, a man with tired eyes and a perfectly straight tie, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. "Arthur's estate is complex," Harrison began, his voice dry. However, his instructions were explicitly clear. He updated this document just 6 weeks before his passing. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed greed. Richard stopped checking his emails. "To my niece, Beatrice Higgins Smythe," Harrison read from the thick parchment, "I leave the entirety of the property located at 442 Elm Street, including all surrounding acreage, free and clear of any encumbrances." Beatrice let out a breath she had clearly been holding. The Elm Street property, despite its dilapidated state, sat on 4 acres of prime urban land. Developers had been eyeing it for years. "To my nephew, Richard Higgins," the lawyer continued, "I leave the contents of my brokerage accounts, primarily the index funds and municipal bonds, which currently total approximately $4.2 million. Richard offered a curt nod, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He leaned back, lacing his fingers over his stomach. "Sensible," he murmured. The old man knew who could actually manage capital. Clara swallowed hard. She didn't want millions. She was drowning in the medical debt left behind by her late husband, David, who had lost his battle with pancreatic cancer 2 years prior. Just enough to pay off the hospital, perhaps fix her car's transmission. That was all she prayed for. Harrison turned the page. He paused, his brow furrowing slightly, before looking up at Clara with a gaze that held a flicker of genuine pity. And finally, Harrison read, "To my niece, Clara Higgins. Clara, who offered me her time when time was the only thing slipping away from me. To Clara, I leave the Elliott tall-case clock currently residing in the primary study, and all it contains. May it serve you better than it served me." Silence descended on the office. Clara blinked, processing the words. The grandfather clock, the massive, ugly, dark wood behemoth that hadn't ticked a single second since 1998. A sharp, barking laugh broke the silence. It was Richard. He clapped a hand over his mouth, his face turning red as he tried to stifle his amusement. Beatrice didn't even try to hide her contempt. She let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief. "A clock?" Beatrice scoffed, looking at Clara. "He left you a broken piece of firewood? God, Clara, I told you all those Sunday visits were a waste of your time." The man was completely senile at the end. "It's not firewood," Clara said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "It was his favorite. We used to sit by it." "Well, sentiment doesn't pay the rent, sweetie," Richard chuckled, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "But look, I'm feeling generous. If you need $50 to hire a truck to haul that piece of junk to the city dump, I'll spot you." "I'm keeping it," Clara said, lifting her chin. Harrison Gable looked at her gently. "Miss Higgins, I must advise you, the estate will not cover the cost of moving the item, and the house must be vacated by the end of the month, so Beatrice can begin the demolition process." Clara nodded, fighting the sting of tears in her eyes. "I understand. I'll have it out by Friday." As they left the office, Beatrice pulled Clara aside in the lobby. "Listen, Clara, don't be dramatic about this. Arthur was crazy. I'll be gutting the house and selling off whatever garbage is left to antique dealers. I can have them take the clock. Save yourself the headache." "He left it to me, Beatrice. It's mine." Beatrice rolled her eyes. "Fine. Live in your cramped little apartment with a broken clock. Always the martyr, aren't you?" Clara walked out into the cold New York air, clutching her thin coat around her. She had gained nothing of monetary value, but she had kept her dignity. What she didn't know, what no one in that room could possibly comprehend, was the immense gravity of the phrase and all it contains. Moving the Elliott Tollcase clock proved to be a logistical nightmare that nearly broke Clara financially and physically. Standing at over 8 feet tall, the clock was a monstrous structure of heavily carved, blackened mahogany. Its face was tarnished brass, the Roman numerals faded, and the intricate moondial at the top was jammed halfway through a lunar cycle. When Clara had hired 2 local movers, Stan and Mike, to transport it, they had severely underestimated the job. "Lady, what the hell is in this thing?" Stan had grunted, his face purple with exertion, as he and Mike tried to pivot the clock out of Arthur's dusty study. "We move pianos lighter than this." "It's just old wood and weights," Clara apologized, hovering anxiously as they navigated the narrow hallways. "It feels like it's bolted to the floor," Mike added, wiping sweat from his forehead. They had to charge her double their initial quote, claiming it required specialized equipment. Clara had to put the $400 charge on her already maxed out credit card. When they finally wrestled it into her second-floor walk-up apartment, the clock dominated the space. Her living room was tiny, holding only a modest sofa, a small television, and a bookshelf. The clock stood in the corner like a silent, brooding sentinel, its top scraping the popcorn ceiling. Over the next few months, the mockery intensified. Word of the will had spread through their extended family. At Thanksgiving, hosted at Beatrice's newly renovated suburban mansion, Clara became the punchline of every conversation. "So, Clara," Cousin Philip asked over turkey and cranberry sauce, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "how's the antique business? Has the clock started ticking backward to give you your youth back?" The table erupted into laughter. Richard wiped a tear from his eye. "I offered to pay for the dump run, Philip, but no, she paid hundreds of dollars to put a termite hotel in her living room." Clara kept her eyes on her plate, her cheeks burning. "It reminds me of Uncle Arthur. That's enough for me." "It's hoarding, Clara," Beatrice chimed in, swirling her Chardonnay. "It's exactly how Arthur started. You need to be careful, or you'll end up exactly like him, alone and surrounded by junk." The words stung, burrowing deep into Clara's insecurities. She was exhausted. The hospital had cut her hours, and her landlord, Mr. Henderson, had recently slid a notice under her door detailing a 15% rent increase starting in January. She was on the precipice of ruin. That night, returning to her dark, chilly apartment, Clara didn't turn on the lights immediately. She dropped her purse on the floor and collapsed onto the sofa, staring at the shadowy silhouette of the grandfather clock. For the first time, resentment bubbled up inside her. Why had Arthur done this? He had money. He had millions. He knew she was struggling. He knew David's medical bills were suffocating her. Why a broken clock? Driven by a sudden, irrational burst of anger, Clara stood up and marched over to the enormous timepiece. "Why?" she whispered to the unmoving hands. "Why did you leave me this?" She slammed her open palm against the side of the wooden casing. It didn't echo with the hollow sound of a wooden cabinet. Instead, there was a heavy, dense thud. Clara frowned, the anger instantly giving way to confusion. She knocked on the side again with her knuckles. It felt solid, too solid. She opened the long glass door that housed the pendulum and the weights. A smell of old oil and stale air wafted out. The massive brass pendulum hung motionless, jammed tightly against the backboard. Hanging on either side were the 3 weight cylinders usually filled with lead to drive the clock's mechanisms. Clara reached out and grasped the heaviest weight, the one that powered the hourly strike. She tried to lift it slightly to see if the chain would move. She strained, her muscles protesting, but the weight barely budged. It was impossibly heavy. Curiosity fully piqued, Clara went to her kitchen and retrieved a heavy-duty flashlight and a small flathead screwdriver. Returning to the clock, she shone the beam inside the dark casing. The wood inside was scratched and looked altered. The backboard behind the pendulum didn't match the side panels. It looked slightly newer, and the edges where it met the sides were sealed with a dark, hardened resin. She looked back at the weights. They were heavily tarnished, almost black, with decades of grime. Taking the screwdriver, Clara gently scraped at the bottom of the strike weight, intending to see the dull grey lead underneath. The screwdriver chipped away the thick layer of black grime and a thin coating of grey paint. Underneath, in the harsh glare of the flashlight, the metal didn't shine grey. It gleamed with a brilliant, unmistakable, heavy yellow luster. Clara stopped breathing. Her hands began to shake so violently she dropped the screwdriver. It clattered against the wooden floorboards, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. She leaned in closer, touching the deep, yellow scratch. Gold. The weight wasn't lead, it was solid gold, and it was just one of 3. But as she looked up at the modified backboard of the clock, a terrifying, exhilarating thought crossed her mind. If the weights are solid gold, what is behind the false wall? Sleep was entirely out of the question. Clara sat cross-legged on her faded rug, the flashlight beam illuminating the deep, buttery yellow gouge she had carved into the heavy clock weight. Her pulse pounded in her ears, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the racing of her thoughts. She needed to be sure. Crawling on her hands and knees to the kitchen drawers, she found a serrated steak knife. Returning to the clock, she dragged the blade across the second weight, and then the third. Yellow, yellow, yellow. All 3 weights, each roughly the size of a large thermos, were cast from solid gold and meticulously disguised beneath layers of black, enamel, and grey lead paint. Uncle Arthur had always ranted about the fragility of fiat currency, but no one had truly listened. Clara quickly pulled out her smartphone, her thumbs trembling as she searched the current spot price of gold. It was hovering near $2,000 an ounce. If these weights were as heavy as the movers complained they were perhaps 30 pounds each, she was looking at close to $3 million, just hanging casually from rusted chains in her living room. But it was the false backboard of the Elliott tall case clock that held her attention now. The gold weights were merely the appetizer, a brilliant misdirection for whoever might try to appraise the clock at a glance. Clara retrieved a hammer and a crowbar she kept for minor apartment repairs. The resin sealing the back panel was old, but incredibly stubborn. She worked for hours, chipping away the hardened seal, mindful of the noise she was making in the dead of night. By 4 a.m., her hands were blistered and bleeding, her knuckles raw. With one final, desperate heave, the crowbar caught the edge of the mahogany panel. A loud crack echoed through the room as the wood splintered and the false back gave way. It tumbled forward, landing with a heavy thud on the floorboards. Clara shined her flashlight into the revealed cavity. It wasn't a vault of coins, as her exhausted mind had wildly hypothesized. Instead, nestled snugly within a custom-built, zinc-lined alcove, sat a heavy, fireproof lockbox. Beside it, perfectly preserved in a thick leather binding, was a ledger, and resting atop the ledger was an incredibly intricate, heavy brass gear, the missing component that had jammed the moon dial at the top of the clock. Clara pulled the ledger out first. The pages were filled with Uncle Arthur's spidery, precise handwriting. It wasn't a diary of a madman. It was a meticulous financial manifesto. The first page was dated the 14th of October 1987, 5 days before Black Monday. The markets are a house of cards, propped up by fools and charlatans. I have begun the quiet liquidation of my primary industrial assets. Richard thinks he is clever playing with index funds, but he builds castles in the sand. Real wealth must have weight. It must have gravity. Clara flipped through decades of entries. Arthur had systematically drained offshore accounts, liquidated silent partnerships, and funneled the cash through obscure, untraceable shell companies to purchase physical gold bullion from private, international dealers. He had amassed a fortune that dwarfed the $4.2 million he had publicly left to Richard. Then, Clara found the entry that made her blood run cold. It was dated just 2 months before Arthur's death. The chamber is complete. 3,120 pounds of 999 fine bullion, safe from the IRS, safe from the banking collapse, and most importantly, safe from Beatrice and Richard. The Elm Street property is the fortress, but the clock is the gatekeeper. The key to the kingdom lies within the heart of time. Clara's breath hitched. The Elm Street property. Beatrice owned Elm Street. Beatrice had inherited the physical ground where the gold was buried. Panicked, Clara unlatched the fireproof lockbox. Inside was a thick roll of architectural blueprints and a heavy, iron skeleton key. She unrolled the blueprints on the floor, using the gold weights to hold down the corners. They were the original 1,912 schematics of the Victorian mansion, but Arthur had drafted heavy modifications over them in red ink. He had excavated a sub-basement beneath the original wine cellar. The entrance was concealed behind a false masonry wall, locked by a specialized mechanical vault door. The blueprints included a highly detailed diagram of the vault's locking mechanism. Clara stared at the diagram, her eyes darting from the paper to the heavy brass gear she had found in the clock. The gear wasn't just a clock part. It was a mechanical key. The iron skeleton key opened the outer access door, but the brass gear was required to engage the tumblers of the primary vault. Without the clock, Beatrice could own the house for a century and never find the vault. If she did find it, she couldn't open it without destroying the structural integrity of the foundation. But there was a terrifying catch. A loose piece of paper slipped from the ledger. It was a copy of a contract from a commercial demolition company. Clara read the date. Beatrice had fast-tracked the demolition of the Elm Street mansion. The wrecking balls were scheduled to tear the house apart in exactly 9 days. Once the heavy machinery ripped into the foundation, the sub-basement would be exposed. The demolition crew would find the gold, or Beatrice would. Either way, Clara's inheritance, the true inheritance Arthur had designed for her, would be lost forever, legally entangled, or stolen. She had 9 days to steal $198 million in gold from her sister's heavily monitored property. "I just need 15 minutes, Gary, please." Clara stood on the porch of the Elm Street mansion 3 days later, holding a small, empty cardboard box. The crisp autumn wind whipped her hair across her face. Gary, Beatrice's contracted project manager, leaned against the heavy oak front door, a clipboard pressed against his chest. He was a burly man with a permanent scowl, chewing on a toothpick. "Look, lady," Gary grunted, looking her up and down. "Your sister gave strict orders. Nobody inside. The place is structurally unsound. We've already disconnected the mainline power, and we start asbestos abatement tomorrow. It's a liability." I know, Clara said, forcing her voice to tremble slightly, playing up the image of the grieving, pathetic sister that Beatrice had undoubtedly painted her as. "But I realized I left my husband's silver pocket watch in Uncle Arthur's study when I moved the grandfather clock. It's all I have left of him. Please, just let me run in and grab it." "Beatrice doesn't even have to know." Gary sighed, checking his watch. 10 minutes. "I'm waiting right here. You break an ankle. You didn't see me. Thank you, Clara breathed, slipping past him into the cavernous, echoing foyer. The house was a shell of its former self. The antique furniture had been pillaged, the rugs rolled up and sold, dust hung thick in the air, catching the pale light filtering through dirty windows. Clara didn't go to the study. The moment she was out of Gary's line of sight, she pulled a small flashlight from her coat pocket and sprinted silently toward the kitchen at the back of the house. Behind the pantry was the heavy wooden door leading to the basement. She slipped through it, descending the creaking wooden stairs into total darkness. The basement smelled of damp earth and rotting timber. Clara flicked on her flashlight, her beam cutting through the gloom. She navigated past old water heaters and forgotten trunks until she reached the far north wall, the wine cellar. According to Arthur's blueprints, the false wall was located behind the third arched brick alcove. Clara counted them out. 1, 2, 3. She stood before a solid wall of century-old red brick. It looked completely flush, entirely undisturbed. But Clara knew Arthur was a master of horology, a man who built mechanisms with tolerances measured in millimeters. She ran her fingers along the mortar of the bricks, exactly 3 feet from the floor, feeling for the anomaly, the blueprint detailed. Her fingers brushed against a piece of mortar that felt slightly smoother than the rest. She pressed it hard. There was a faint click. A section of the brickwork, perfectly counterweighted, swung inward with a ghostly silence, revealing a narrow, pitch-black corridor lined with concrete. Clara's heart hammered a frantic tattoo against her ribs. She stepped into the corridor, shining the light ahead. At the end of the 10-foot passage stood a heavy steel door, painted to look like rusted iron. In the center of the door was an old-fashioned keyhole, and above it, a circular depression exactly the size of the heavy brass gear from the clock. She had found it. "Hey, time's up," Gary's voice echoed faintly from the top of the basement stairs. "Let's go, lady," Clara cursed under her breath. She didn't have the gear or the key with her today. This was purely a reconnaissance mission to ensure the blueprints were accurate and the entrance was accessible. She quickly pulled the brick wall shut, ensuring it latched, and ran back up the stairs, purposefully rubbing dust onto her cheeks and coat to look disheveled. When she emerged in the foyer, she offered Gary a sad, defeated shake of her head. "I couldn't find it. Maybe it was lost in the move." "Tough break," Gary said, devoid of sympathy as he ushered her out and locked the front door. "Don't come back. The perimeter fence goes up tomorrow." That night, Clara sat at her small kitchen table, the gold weights acting as a centerpiece, surrounded by notepads and calculators. She had a massive logistical nightmare on her hands. The gold in that vault weighed over 3,000 pounds. Even if she could break in at night, evade whatever security Beatrice might install, and open the vault, she physically could not carry 1.5 tons of gold up a flight of basement stairs and into a vehicle by herself. She needed a truck with heavy-duty suspension. She needed a way to move the gold quietly, and most terrifyingly, she needed help. Clara thought about her contacts. Her friends from the clinic were good people, but they were nurses and orderlies, not people you approach with a felony-level heist proposition. If she hired professionals, they might just rob her and leave her in the basement. Her eyes drifted to the faded photograph of David on her refrigerator. Next to it was a business card she hadn't looked at in years. Marcus Mac Vance, Heavy Machinery and Custom Transport. Mac was David's oldest friend from their time serving in the military. He was rough around the edges, fiercely loyal, and currently running an independent freight business that was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. More importantly, Mac despised Richard and Beatrice for the way they had treated David when he got sick. Clara picked up her phone. Her hands were sweating. If she made this call, there was no turning back. She would cross a line from a grieving widow clutching a broken clock into something entirely different. She would become a thief in the eyes of the law, stealing from her own sister's property. But as she looked at the yellow gleam of the solid gold weight, she remembered Arthur's final written words, "Safe from Beatrice and Richard." Arthur wanted her to have this. He had designed a test of character, of loyalty, and of sheer will. Beatrice got the dirt, Richard got the paper, Clara got the gravity. She dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a gruff, tired voice answered. "Vance." "Mac," Clara said, her voice steady, surprising even herself. "It's Clara Higgins." A pause on the line. The tone softened immediately. "Clara? Good Lord, it's been a minute. Is everything okay? You need something?" "I need to rent your heavy-duty box truck," Clara said, staring straight at the blueprints. "The one with the reinforced shocks and the hydraulic liftgate. And Mac, I need you to drive it. Off the books? No questions asked." Mac let out a low whistle. "Off the books?" "Clara, what exactly are you moving?" Clara smiled, a sharp, uncharacteristically dangerous expression crossing her face. "I'm moving a legacy, Mac, and if you help me, I guarantee you'll never have to worry about your truck payments again." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'll be at your place in an hour," Mac said. The line clicked dead. The pieces were in motion, the clock was ticking, and Clara was finally ready to play Uncle Arthur's game. Rain lashed against the windshield of the battered International Harvester box truck, blurring the amber glow of the streetlights. Inside the cab, the heater rattled violently, smelling faintly of diesel fumes and stale coffee. Clara sat in the passenger seat, clutching the heavy iron skeleton key and the intricate brass gear in her lap. Beside her, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension, was Mac Sullivan. Mac had listened to her story 2 nights ago with a mixture of profound skepticism and awe. When she had dropped one of the solid gold clock weights onto his kitchen table, a piece of metal, no larger than a travel mug but weighing over 30 pounds, his skepticism had vanished. He had immediately cashed in his last remaining favors to secure a heavy-duty hydraulic pallet jack, a set of reinforced moving dollies from a company called U-Line, and this unmarked, dual-axle truck capable of hauling heavy freight without riding low on the suspension. 3 a.m., Mac muttered, checking the luminous dial of his watch. "Gary and his demolition crew won't be back on site until 6:30. The neighborhood is dead. This is as good a window as we're going to get." Clara nodded, her throat entirely too dry to speak. She was dressed in dark utility clothes, a heavy canvas jacket, and steel-toed boots Mac had forced her to buy. Mac killed the engine half a block down from the Elm Street property. They sat in the sudden, oppressive silence, listening to the rain. Beatrice had indeed erected a chain-link perimeter fence, but Mac had already scouted a blind spot behind the overgrown rhododendron bushes near the eastern property line. "All right," Mac said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "We execute exactly as planned. We back the truck into the old carriage driveway. It's obscured from the street by the oak trees. We get the pallet jack down the basement storm doors. We load, we lift, we leave. If anyone drives by, we are late-night contractors doing emergency asbestos removal. Put your respirator mask around your neck." Stepping out into the freezing downpour, Clara felt a surge of adrenaline obliterate her exhaustion. They worked with practiced, silent efficiency. Mac picked the padlock on the secondary gate with a pair of bolt cutters, easing the heavy chain down so it wouldn't rattle. He then backed the truck down the muddy, unpaved carriage path, the tires spinning slightly in the wet earth before catching. Lowering the hydraulic liftgate with a low hum, they rolled the heavy steel pallet jack toward the exterior storm doors of the basement. Uncle Arthur had used these slanted wooden doors to bring in coal decades ago. Mac pried the rusted hasp off with a crowbar, and together they eased the heavy equipment down the concrete ramp into the subterranean darkness of the house. The air in the basement was thick and musty. Clara clicked on her heavy-duty DeWalt flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the familiar path to the wine cellar. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the third arched brick alcove. She pressed the smooth patch of mortar. The counterweighted section of the wall swung silently inward, revealing the narrow concrete corridor. Mac let out a low whistle, instantly silenced as they stepped into the passage. At the end of the corridor stood the heavy, faux-rusted steel door. Clara stepped forward. Her hands were shaking as she lifted the heavy brass gear she had extracted from the Elliott tall case clock. She aligned the teeth of the gear with the circular depression above the keyhole. It fit with a satisfying magnetic clack. Next, she inserted the iron skeleton key into the main lock. Arthur wrote that the gear engages the primary tumblers, but the key releases the deadbolts. Clara whispered. Turn them at the exact same time, counterclockwise. Mac placed his thick, calloused hand over hers on the brass gear. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They turned. The resistance was immense. For a terrifying second, Clara thought the mechanism had rusted solid over the years. Then, with a deafening, metallic clang that echoed in her chest, the internal tumblers gave way. Clara pushed against the heavy steel door. It didn't budge. Mac wedged his shoulder against the metal, planting his boots on the concrete floor, and heaved. With a grinding groan of metal on metal, the vault door swung open. A wave of completely stagnant, cold air washed over them. Clara raised her flashlight, aiming the beam into the hidden chamber. It was a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, lined completely with seamless, welded steel plates. But it wasn't the architecture that made Clara drop to her knees. Stacked precisely in the center of the room, resting on 4 heavy-duty industrial wooden pallets, were rows upon rows of dull, yellow bricks. Mac walked slowly into the room, his flashlight beam trembling. He reached out and picked up the top brick from the nearest stack. It was roughly the size of a standard paperback novel, but as his muscles strained to lift it, the reality of its density became apparent. Credit Suisse, Mac breathed, reading the stamped hallmark on the face of the bar. 1 kilogram, 9,999, fine gold. He looked at the pallets. There were hundreds of them. Clara, he whispered, his voice cracking. There has to be over a ton of gold here, maybe a ton and a half. 3,120 pounds, Clara recited. Uncle Arthur's ledger permanently burned into her memory. At current spot prices, it's roughly $198 million. Mac gently set the gold bar back onto the stack. He turned to look at her, the reality of the situation fully settling in. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was generational wealth, hidden in the dark, waiting to be claimed by the one person who actually gave a damn about the man who buried it. We need to move fast, Mac said, his professional instincts kicking into overdrive. Gold is astronomically heavy. We can't put more than 1,000 pounds on the pallet jack at once, or we won't be able to push it up the storm door ramp. That means 3 trips. Minimum. Sweat stung Clara's eyes, mixing with the grime and dust of the basement. Her muscles screamed in agony. Every single kilogram bar they transferred from Arthur's pallets to their own rolling U-line dollies felt like it was tethered to the center of the earth. Gold possesses a density that defies human intuition. A box that looked like it should weigh 20 pounds weighed over 100. They had to work methodically, packing the bars into heavy-duty canvas duffel bags to disguise the cargo before loading them onto the pallet jack. By 4:45 a.m., they had successfully winched the first load up the concrete ramp of the storm doors and onto the hydraulic lift gate of the International Harvester. The truck's suspension groaned in protest as the heavy metal was secured in the cargo bay. They were halfway through the second load, deep in the subterranean vault, when the complication arrived. Max suddenly froze, dropping a gold bar back onto the pallet with a dull thud. He held up a hand, signaling for absolute silence. Clara stopped breathing. Above them, through the thick floorboards of the kitchen, came the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps. Someone was in the house. "Gary?" Clara mouthed to Mac, her eyes wide with terror. Mac shook his head slowly. Too early. And Gary would be yelling on his phone. That's a slow, deliberate walk. Someone is sweeping the perimeter. Clara remembered the insurance clause Beatrice had mentioned casually at Thanksgiving. Because the house was an unsecured liability prior to demolition, her insurance carrier, a massive firm called Hanover Fidelity, had mandated random overnight security patrols to prevent squatters. The footsteps moved from the kitchen toward the hallway. Then they stopped. A beam of blinding white light cut through the cracks in the floorboards directly above the basement door. A heavy hand rattled the doorknob. Finding it unlocked because Mac and Clara had bypassed the kitchen entirely to use the storm doors, the door creaked open. Heavy boots began to descend the wooden stairs into the basement. "Hey, Command Center, this is Unit 4. I've got an open interior door at the Elm Street site." Moving to investigate, a deep, authoritative voice echoed into the cavernous space. Panic seized Clara's chest. If the guard came into the wine cellar, he would see the open brick wall. He would see the vault. He would see the gold. It would be confiscated, locked in legal limbo, and Beatrice's lawyers would descend like vultures to claim it as property discovered on her estate. Mac reacted with terrifying speed. He grabbed Clara by the canvas jacket and shoved her roughly against the steel wall of the vault. Pressing himself in front of her, he reached out and hauled the heavy vault door shut until only a 2-inch gap remained, plunging them into near-total darkness. Through the narrow gap, Clara watched the beam of the guard's tactical flashlight sweep across the basement. It illuminated the water heaters, the forgotten trunks, and then, agonizingly, slowly, swept toward the wine cellar. "Anyone down here?" the guard yelled, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Private property. Come out with your hands empty." The guard stepped into the wine cellar. The beam of his flashlight hit the third arched brick alcove. Clara closed her eyes, preparing for the shout of discovery. She had failed. After everything, the gold would be lost. But Mac hadn't just closed the vault door. When they first entered the hidden corridor, his paranoid freight driver instincts had kicked in. He had carefully pulled the counterweighted false brick wall, mostly shut behind them, leaving only a tiny sliver open for air. The guard's flashlight swept right past the brickwork. From the outside, in the dim light, the seam was entirely invisible. "Command, basement is clear." The guard's voice crackled over his radio, sounding bored. "Just wind blowing the door open, probably. Place is a structural nightmare." Returning to patrol vehicle, the heavy boots retreated up the stairs. The basement door shut with a solid click. Clara slumped against the cold steel of the vault, her legs entirely giving out. She slid to the floor, gasping for air, as her heart threatened to beat right out of her ribcage. Mac pushed the vault door open and let out a long, ragged exhale. "That," he whispered, wiping a streak of grease from his forehead, "was entirely too close." "We have to hurry," Clara said, forcing herself back to her feet, though her knees trembled violently. "If he comes back to check the perimeter, he'll see the storm doors open." The final hour was a blur of frantic, agonizing labor. The physical toll of moving the last 1,000 pounds of gold was almost entirely eclipsed by the psychological terror of the guard returning. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the house settling, sounded like a siren. By 5:50 a.m., the sky outside was beginning to bruise with the dark purple of early dawn. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. They pushed the final pallet jack load onto the lift gate. As Mac hit the hydraulic control to raise it into the truck, Clara stood in the mud, looking back at the open storm doors. She ran back down into the basement one last time. She moved through the wine cellar, into the corridor, and stood before the empty vault. The heavy wooden pallets were bare. The legacy was gone. Clara pulled the heavy steel door shut, hearing the tumblers click back into their locked position. She stepped out of the corridor and pushed the false brick wall closed. It sealed with a seamless, dusty thud. Let the demolition crew tear the house down. Let Beatrice inherit the rubble and the empty steel box beneath it. The true value of Elm Street was already riding on the reinforced suspension of Max Sullivan's unmarked truck. Clara ran up the storm ramp, closing the slanted wooden doors and replacing the broken hasp to look untouched from a distance. She climbed into the passenger seat of the truck, slamming the door shut. Mac threw the engine into gear, and they slowly rolled out of the carriage driveway, merging onto the slick, empty streets of Albany just as the first sliver of morning sun breached the horizon. Clara looked in the side mirror, watching the silhouette of the Elm Street mansion fade into the distance. She reached into her canvas jacket and pulled out the heavy brass gear, running her thumb over the intricate teeth. Uncle Arthur had known exactly what he was doing. He knew Beatrice would tear the house down for a quick profit, blind to the foundation it stood upon. He knew Richard would scoff at a broken clock, arrogant in his modern financial models. And he knew Clara would keep the timepieces. "Where to, boss?" Mac asked, a tired, victorious grin spreading across his face as he navigated the truck toward the highway. Clara looked straight ahead, the weight of $198 million settling onto the axles beneath her. "We head to the storage facility in Vermont. Then, we hire a very, very good tax attorney." Heavy steel doors of the climate-controlled storage unit in rural Vermont slammed shut, echoing with a resounding finality that made Clara's knees weak. For the first time in 3 days, she could finally breathe. Stacked neatly on reinforced industrial shelving sat 3,120 pounds of Credit Suisse gold bullion. It was no longer a myth, a ledger entry, or a burden buried in the dark. It was real, and it was hers. Max Sullivan locked the heavy Medico padlock and tossed the only 2 keys into Clara's trembling hands. He leaned against the side of the battered box truck, lighting a cigarette and taking a long, slow drag. "Well, Clara," Max said, exhaling a plume of grey smoke into the crisp morning air. "We did it. We actually robbed a ghost, and we got away with it." "Not yet," Clara replied, her voice steadying as the adrenaline finally began to ebb, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity she had never possessed before. "Uncle Arthur was brilliant, but Beatrice is ruthless. When she finds that empty vault, she won't just let it go. She will hunt down every penny of the estate. We need armor, legal armor." 72 hours later, Clara sat in the high-rise, glass-walled office of Josephine Sterling, one of the most feared and respected asset protection attorneys in Manhattan. Josephine was a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s, wearing a pristine white suit and an expression that suggested she had seen every iteration of human greed. Clara had placed Uncle Arthur's ledger, the heavy brass gear, and one of the solid gold clock weights on the polished glass desk. She laid out the entire story, omitting only Mac's involvement to protect him. Josephine listened in silence, her piercing eyes flicking between Clara and the gleaming yellow weight. When Clara finished, the attorney picked up the leather-bound ledger, her manicured fingers delicately turning the pages. "Your uncle," Josephine murmured, a rare smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "was a paranoid, cynical, absolute genius. You didn't steal anything, Clara. You merely retrieved your property." Clara frowned, confused. "But the gold was physically located on Beatrice's property. Doesn't the law state that fixtures and discoveries on the land belong to the deed holder?" "Normally, yes," Josephine explained, pulling a folded, notarized document from a hidden pocket in the back of the ledger. "If it were abandoned treasure or a lost stash. But Arthur didn't leave this to chance. Look at this." Josephine slid the heavy parchment across the desk. It was a deed of gift, dated and notarized 2 years prior to Arthur's death. "I, Arthur Pendleton," Clara read aloud, her voice wavering, "do hereby irrevocably gift, transfer, and assign all physical bullion assets currently secured within the Elm Street sub-basement vault to the designated inheritor of the Elliott Tallcase clock and all it contains. The physical location of said assets is temporary and does not constitute a fixture of the real estate." "He separated the mineral rights from the property rights," Josephine said, leaning back in her leather chair. "Legally, Beatrice inherited a dirt lot and a house. You inherited a highly specific, legally documented mobile asset that just happened to be parked in her basement. She has zero legal claim to it. In fact, by locking you out of the property, she was unlawfully detaining your assets. We are going to build a trust so impenetrable that your sister couldn't pierce it with a bunker-busting missile." While Clara secured her future in Manhattan, a vastly different scene was unfolding in Albany. Demolition Day at the Elm Street property was treated as a victory lap by Beatrice Higgins Smythe. She had invited Richard, several local real estate developers, and a catering company that was currently serving mimosas out of the back of a van parked near the perimeter fence. Beatrice stood in her designer trench coat, holding a crystal flute of champagne, watching with gleeful anticipation as Gary directed the massive Caterpillar excavator toward the crumbling Victorian facade. Finally, Beatrice sneered, clinking her glass against Richard's. Good riddance to the old bat and his moldy museum. Cheers to that, Richard chuckled, checking his stock portfolio on his phone. The market was taking a slight downturn, but he brushed it off. I'm just glad Clara isn't here crying over the wallpaper. With a deafening roar, the excavator's hydraulic arm swung forward. The heavy steel bucket crashed through the front parlor window, tearing away a massive chunk of the mahogany framing and brickwork. Dust billowed into the sky like gray smoke. For 2 hours, the machine methodically ripped the house apart. The roof caved in, the walls folded like cardboard, and centuries of history were reduced to splinters and crushed masonry. Then, the excavator moved to clear the debris from the foundation. Gary signaled the operator to scrape away the remnants of the kitchen floor to level the basement. The steel teeth of the bucket dug deep into the earth, but instead of pulling up dirt and broken floorboards, there was a horrific screech of metal grinding against metal. The massive caterpillar machine shuddered, its tracks slipping as the bucket caught on something impossibly unyielding. Gary jogged over, waving his arms frantically, to cut the engine. The dust slowly settled, revealing a massive, gaping hole where the wine cellar used to be. But it wasn't a standard basement floor. Exposed beneath the crushed bricks was a seamless, custom-welded steel cube. The excavator's bucket had scraped the top of it, tearing away the dirt to reveal a massive, faux-rusted steel vault door, slightly ajar, hanging off its heavy iron hinges. Beatrice's smile vanished. She dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the pavement. "Gary!" Beatrice shrieked, hiking up her coat and scrambling over the perimeter fence, heedless of the mud ruining her Italian leather boots. "What is that? What is down there?" Richard followed closely behind, his face pale. Gary had already climbed down into the crater. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his tool belt and shined it through the partially open vault door. "Looks like a safe room, Mrs. Higgins Smythe," Gary yelled up, coughing through the dust. "A big one, custom built." Beatrice's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. A vault. Arthur had a vault. Visions of stacked cash, rare antiquities, and unimaginable wealth flashed before her eyes. The old man was richer than anyone knew, and it was all buried on her property. "Open it!" she screamed, her voice shrill with raw greed. "Pry that door open right now." Gary grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the excavator cab. He wedged it into the gap of the heavy steel door and threw his entire body weight against it. With a sickening groan, the heavy door swung outward. Beatrice and Richard scrambled down the dirt embankment, ignoring the safety warnings from the crew. They practically shoved Gary aside to stare into the hidden chamber. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness. It hit the cold, bare steel walls. It illuminated the 4 empty, heavy-duty, industrial wooden pallets sitting in the center of the room. It highlighted the deep, rectangular scuff marks on the floor where unimaginable weight had recently been moved. The vault was completely, utterly empty. Beatrice stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking. "No, no, no. Where is it? What was in here?" Richard pushed past her, stepping into the empty steel room. He looked at the floor, seeing the fresh tire tracks from a heavy pallet jack trailing out through a destroyed section of the false brick wall that led toward the old storm doors. "Someone was here," Richard said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "Someone cleared this out. Recently." Beatrice let out an unearthly scream of rage. "Call the police. Lock down the site. Someone robbed my property. Millions. There could have been millions in here." The ensuing police investigation was swift and entirely fruitless. The detectives found the tire tracks leading to the carriage driveway, but the heavy rain from 3 nights ago had washed away any distinct tread marks. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no security footage. 2 weeks later, Beatrice and Richard sat in the sterile conference room of the Albany Police Precinct. Detective Miller, a tired-looking man with a graying mustache, slid a single piece of paper across the table. "We found this lodged behind one of the wooden pallets in the vault," Miller said flatly. "It must have fallen out when whoever emptied the room was moving the cargo." Beatrice snatched the paper. It was a photocopy of a purchase receipt from a Swiss refinery. Item 1 kilogram, 9,999. Fine gold bullion bar. Quantity 1,415. Purchaser A. Pendleton. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. The room spun. 1,415 kilograms of gold, over 3,000 pounds. At current market value, it was nearly $200 million. They stole $200 million from me, Beatrice sobbed, slamming her fists on the table. Find them. It's my money. Detective Miller sighed. Mrs. Higgins Smythe, we've reviewed the estate documents. Even if we find the gold, the legal department has informed us that due to a specific deed of gift registered by your late uncle, the contents of that vault did not legally belong to you. You merely own the dirt surrounding it. Then who owns it? Richard demanded, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Miller checked his notes. According to the legal trust recently filed by a Manhattan law firm, the assets belong exclusively to the owner of an Elliott tall case clock. Complete, suffocating silence descended on the interrogation room. Richard slowly turned to look at Beatrice. The memory of the lawyer's office hit them both simultaneously. The laughter, the mockery. Richard offering $50 for a dump run. Beatrice calling Clara a martyr, holding onto a piece of broken firewood. Clara, Beatrice whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. That little bitch. She knew. She didn't know, Richard realized, his voice hollow, a profound sickness settling in his stomach. Arthur made sure of it. He left her the key, and he left us the empty box. The fallout was spectacular. Beatrice spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on aggressive litigation, trying to sue Clara's newly formed trust. Josephine Sterling dismantled Beatrice's legal team in court with surgical precision, forcing Beatrice to pay Clara's legal fees due to a frivolous lawsuit clause. The financial strain, combined with the sudden halt of the Elm Street development due to the vault discovery, pushed Beatrice to the brink of bankruptcy. Richard fared no better. 6 months after the demolition, the commercial real estate market experienced a sudden, violent crash, exactly as Uncle Arthur's ledger had predicted. The index funds Richard had smugly inherited plummeted by 40%. His heavily leveraged development projects dried up, leaving him scrambling to cover margin calls. He went from a multi-millionaire to a desperate man, drowning in toxic debt in less than a year. Clara never spoke to them again. She didn't have to. She paid off David's medical bills the very first week. She bought Max Sullivan a brand new, top-of-the-line Peterbilt freight truck, fully paid off, ensuring his business would thrive for decades. She funded a pediatric cancer wing at the hospital where she used to work double shifts, naming it after her late husband. But she didn't buy a mansion, and she didn't buy designer clothes. Clara purchased a beautiful, quiet farmhouse in upstate New York, surrounded by acres of ancient oak trees and rolling green hills. In the center of her new, sunlit living room stood the massive Elliott tall case clock. She had hired a master horologist to repair it. He had carefully removed the 3 solid gold weights, replacing them with standard lead, and locked the gold safely away in a maximum security depository. He had cleaned the gears, oiled the escapement, and finally, after 25 years of silence, set the heavy brass pendulum in motion. Clara sat in a comfortable armchair with a cup of tea, listening to the deep, steady tick-tock echoing through the farmhouse. It was a comforting sound. It was the sound of vindication, of patience, and of a promise kept. The family had laughed at her for holding on to broken time, completely unaware that time was the only thing that truly pays. Time is the ultimate equalizer. For Beatrice and Richard, it brought the ruin of their arrogance, stripping away their unearned wealth and exposing the hollow core of their greed. They inherited fortunes built on paper and dirt, only to watch them crumble when the world shifted. But for Clara, time brought salvation. She endured years of relentless mockery, bearing the heavy burden of a broken clock, simply out of love for a forgotten uncle. That quiet loyalty unlocked a hidden legacy that changed her life forever. Uncle Arthur understood that true value isn't found in flashy bank accounts or prime real estate. It is found in weight, in gravity, and in the character of the person holding it. The grandfather clock finally ticks again in Clara's farmhouse, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat, serving as a permanent reminder. Those who respect time will always be rewarded by it.